All right, class, this is another lecture. This lecture is going to be revolving around chapter 17, which looks at the expansion of states in what the book refers to as Afroeurasia, or what more old-fashioned people like me would refer to as the Eastern Hemisphere. You know, basically we're talking about Asia, Europe, and Africa. Now, the book points to a number of things that facilitated the expansion of empires. Now, first and foremost is gunpowder. Now, in the last chapter, it was gunpowder was mentioned. It was mentioned that the earliest gun that we know of was found in what nowadays would be northern China. The area of Manchuria from around about the year 1200. And as the book mentions, the earliest guns were not accurate. They were basically just tubes, and people shot stuff out of the tubes at other folks. And they didn't particularly shoot straight, but they were loud and noisy. They were loud, and when they did hit, they really hurt stuff. And but what we see is that over time, people learned how to make guns more effective. And one of the things that's really important here, and this is something that's not mentioned as clearly in this chapter, but basically from the period of European expansion, which starts around a little bit before 1500, until we get to the period of, say, 1750, 1800, pretty much everybody in the old world gets access to guns, and people learn how to make guns. And it's really interesting because this chapter starts off with the story uh, of the Moroccan ruler El Mansur, and how he sends his lieutenant Judar Pasha into the Sudanic state of Songhai. And it's really kind of interesting because when I was talking to you last time, I tried to think of Songhai and I just couldn't place that name. But anyway, this is a famous story about how the Songhai Empire ends. In 1591, Al Mansur sends Judar Pasha south into the Sudan, down the Mali River, down the Niger River, to Songhai. And the Moroccan soldiers are able to quickly overwhelm the Songhai army, even though it's a really huge army, because the Songhai army, which is a cavalry, basically it's a cavalry and infantry, they are all using lances, bows and arrows, swords, that sort of thing. They have no guns. But the Moroccans have access to cannon, and they also have access to rifles or muskets. And so the Songhai Empire is pretty much wiped out after one battle, because the people in Songhai realize that they don't have any weapons that will allow them to effectively counter guns. And this is really important to note that what really gives guns an even greater tactical advantage in the battle between the Moroccan army and the Songhai army is that Songhai is in the part of Africa known as the Sahel, or the Sudanic region of Africa. This is the area where the desert comes to an end and you start to see grasslands. And this is the part of Africa where traditionally, going back to the original kingdom of Ghana, which starts around the 4th century of the Common Era, up until the period of Songhai, these governments had relied on horses and cavalry to give them a military advantage. Now, once the Moroccans get guns, they have an even greater advantage because, since this is a very wide, flat area, and since armies tended to basically match up against each other on open fields, if you had guns or cannons, you had a huge tactical advantage because you could blast your enemy well before they got close enough to do anything with spears or bows and arrows and that sort of thing. And also it's very significant because this meant that the Songhai army did not have cover. They couldn't take cover against guns. And, as you all saw in the last chapter, they talked about how Europeans weren't able to take over African societies. Uh, the Portuguese in particular couldn't take over these areas directly, while they were imposing the slave trade. And the reason for that is that the areas where the slave trade was being imposed, where Europeans were participating in the slave trade, those areas tended to be areas where you had rainforests, you had much thicker vegetation. And thick vegetation and also the diseases that were prevalent in these areas meant that horses could not be used. And also, it meant that if you came into an area like that with the single shot weapons that were common in the 16th and the 17th century, uh, you couldn't have the big open formations of soldiers. Like for instance, they talk about how one of the technique that becomes most common in this period is to have infantrymen following formation. And what you would have is one line of infantrymen would shoot their guns in precision. Then they would back up. Then the next line of infantrymen would come up and shoot their guns. Then they would back up. This meant that each line of soldiers had time to reload. But in a jungle environment, like down in Benin or in Congo, you couldn't have a big wide open field of soldiers just reloading. And this meant that Africans in environments like this, they could hide behind trees, they could hide behind bushes, they could hide behind embankments and poke holes in folks with arrows while they were trying to reload. And so that meant that the forest environment significantly undermined the tactical advantage of gunpowder. And on top of that, since these areas on the coast were engaging in trade, these people pretty quickly got guns. And once Africans got guns, it wasn't long before African blacksmiths looked at guns and figured out how to put them together. And so, within 100 or so years, or maybe even sooner, depending on what part of Africa you're talking about, local people figured out how to make guns. And this became a significant issue, really, until the period of colonialism in the 1880s. But I know I'm getting a little bit off of subject there, but I really think that's important to explain. Now, the next chapter, we're going to look at some more of Africa, and I think that this will kind of help things out. But to get back to the main point of this chapter, gunpowder and the use of gunpowder in the military becomes a massive game changer. The book gives the example of the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Mughal Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Chinese Empire. These are all empires in Afroeurasia that rapidly expanded during this period. And the thing about it, all of those empires, whether you're talking about the Ottomans, whether you're talking about the Safavids in what nowadays is Iran, the Mughals in India, the Russians, the Chinese, all of these people had topography in which not only could you use guns and cannons, but you could also use horses. You could use cavalry as well as infantry in fighting large-scale mass battles, which is very, very different from the terrain that you would see, say, for instance, in Southeast Asia, where you end up with the states of Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam, or in sub-Saharan Africa, where you have places like Benin. Later on, you have places like the Ashanti state, the various Yoruba states, Congo, down in what nowadays is Angola and Democratic Republic of Congo. Those are environments where these large-scale military tactics are not as effective. And so that's something that I don't think is made as clear in this chapter as it should be. And so therefore, I really want you all to think about that when you're reading this. Now, also, the other point that the authors are making here is that, as you see this significant expansion of military power, the other thing that happens in conjunction with this is the expansion of governments. We see governments, central governments, becoming much more powerful. And in some cases, you have large direct administrations. In other cases, local lords still play a significant role as tax collectors, local enforcers, and but overall, with the exception of Japan, and Japan's kind of Japan also is the one place where guns make an appearance, but then gun technology is significantly reduced by government policy. Japan is kind of exceptional because Japan is relatively isolated, and it really doesn't have a lot that outsiders want. Japan does not have gold. It doesn't have, it's not producing cotton. It doesn't have the kind of things that colonial empires were looking for. And so this allows Japan to stay kind of isolated and develop on its own terms. And so that's why Japan goes in an opposite direction. But the point to be made is that in Eurasia, the geography of Eurasia, of much of Eurasia, allows for gun technology to be maximized. Now, one thing I think that you all should look at that I think is very significant and that's talked about in this chapter. This chapter talks about religious friction. For instance, it talks about the conflict between Shia and Sunni Islam. The Ottoman Empire is a Sunni empire. The Safavid Empire of Iran is a Sunni, not Sunni, but a Shia empire. And that's a source of conflict between them. India has a slightly different dynamic in that the Mughals are, they're Muslim, but, India, the Indian subcontinent, the great majority of the population is not Muslim. Muslims are never more than, say, maybe 10, 15% of the population of the Indian subcontinent. And the great majority of people, remain practitioners of Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, these other faiths. Jainism, that's another religion that's pretty prominent in India. But the point to be made is that, like for instance, in the Muslim world, where you have this conflict between Shia and Sunni Muslims. In Europe, after 1517, after Martin Luther, posts his messages on the door in Germany and begins the Reformation, you see significant conflict between Christians, between Catholic Christians and Protestant Christians. And this conflict goes on for about 150 years or so. And basically from about 1517 until the end of the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. And so the thing to notice here that the book doesn't really make this very clear. But the thing to notice is that religious conflict tends to be intra-religious. You have different kinds of Christians fighting each other. You have different kinds of Muslims fighting each other. What you don't really see is Muslim-Christian conflict like you saw during the Crusades during the Middle Ages. As a matter of fact, the Ottomans, the Mughals, and the Safavids are all perfectly happy to hire Christian mercenaries to help them fight against other Muslims. And in particular, the Safavids and the Mughals are very content to hire Christian naval people in order to protect their seacoast. And, even though the book doesn't talk about this very much, I think it's important to realize that there is a tacit recognition among people in positions of power that there's not a lot of point in invading another people to change their religion. What could be an issue of advantage would be to fight people who have your religion and argue over what version. Should you be Shia? Should you be Sunni? In Europe, should you be a Protestant Christian? Should you be Catholic? And so we see that religion becomes a way for people to fight among each other. As a matter of fact, when the book talks about Martin Luther, it mentions that, Martin Luther, he starts out in 1517. By 1520, the church is pretty much tired of him. Had Martin Luther not gotten support from local German princes, he would have been a footnote in history. He would have been some guy who complained about the church, who ended up being burned at the stake for being a heretic. But because local German rulers supported him and saw his religion as a way, his religious reforms as a way to have political legitimacy to fight against the Catholic Church, they supported him. And as a result, significant portions of Northern Europe and Western Europe are now majority Protestant. Germany, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, the British Isles, those areas are all majority Protestant these days. Whereas Catholicism tends to be stronger in Eastern and Southern Europe. And so what we see is that religion becomes a way to express political identity. It becomes a means of declaring political legitimacy. And this is the case whether you're talking in the Muslim world or whether you're talking in the Christian world. And we see also in China, now in China you have people who want to reform their religious traditions. They don't gain quite as much traction. But the desire to reform things is noticeable over there too. But further to the west, in Western Asia and in Europe, a religion really becomes seen as a tool to gain political legitimacy within a culture. But the idea of crusading against people who don't share your religion, that goes away. And what we see is that all of these major powers are willing to hire people from outside of their faith communities if it can help them get in a stronger economic position. Because what we see throughout this entire period, from the 1500s, really going, it really continues throughout the whole period, at least until the 20th century. We see this movement towards the consolidation of political power, the development of ever stronger centralizing states, and the development of stronger administrations, more intensive forms of taxation in order to support larger governments. Those are trends that continue throughout this entire period that we're talking about in this class. And so it's good to take notice of it here, because this is not something that just pops up one time. This is something that continues, throughout the period that we're studying. Now, to kind of go back one more time about the armies again, once again, we do see professional armies developing at this time. The Ottomans and the Safavids, essentially are willing to use slave armies. Although you have to remember that within the Muslim system, especially with the Ottomans, the Janissaries, these were the slave soldiers. They were enslaved for a period of time, but after 25 years they retired. They were very, very well compensated, respected people who were able to establish families and do all those other things. And so they weren't slaves in the sense that we tend to think of slaves in the West, where people are being forced into really dreary, low status labor for which they don't get paid. These were people who quite often had very high positions of authority, and who, especially in the Muslim systems, eventually got freedom. Now, with the Russians, we see not exactly the same thing, but we see a similar situation with the Cossacks. This recruitment of people, many people from Muslim backgrounds, are recruited into the Russian military, and the Russians use them to expand into Siberia. Now, as the book mentions, Russia eventually ends up with the biggest empire in the world in terms of land mass. But the thing to understand about Siberia is that it's very sparsely populated. This is inner Asia, uh, extremely harsh winters, limited agricultural capacity. And so this was never a place that had a huge population. And so, once the Russians get organized, it's not that hard for them to take over. And the Chinese, for instance, who are to the south, when the Russians show up in the 17th century and they negotiate to take control of territory north of the Amur River, the Chinese are like, you can have all that ice, we don't want it. There's not really a big fuss on their part. And so even though the Russians were able to rapidly expand, you kind of have to put that with a grain of salt a little bit because, they're going into territory that most people don't want. Now, it eventually turns out that a lot of this territory is valuable in terms of minerals and resources. And a lot of it has strategic value, but that's not something that really becomes apparent for a few more centuries, as the world becomes smaller, when you have more and more travel and the means of travel become quicker and you have more communications. The value of a lot of the Russian interior becomes more obvious at that time. But during the period we're talking about here, when the Russians are expanding, the advantage is not all that readily apparent. Now, the other thing that I think that's really significant that's talked about in this chapter is the use of the printing press and the expansion of certain languages as vernacular. As the printing press becomes more common in Western Eurasia, now remember, block printing had become common in Asia hundreds of years before you had the printing press in the West. And so China, Japan, Korea already had much higher levels of literacy and much more linguistic continuity than people in the Middle East and in Europe, particularly in Europe. But once you have the printing press, once the movable type printing press is invented by Gutenberg in 1441, and once governments get control of this, it becomes very easy for people to quickly expand language. And so therefore, like for instance, as I'm talking today, this is the period the week after the death of Queen Elizabeth II. And, just to give the example of England, I mean, at the time we're talking about here, Scotland, which is not formally yet part of the United Kingdom, I mean, is ruled, Scotland and England have the same monarch during much of this period, but there's very much two different countries. In Scotland at this time, many people don't speak English at all. They speak Celtic languages that sound nothing like English. In the south of England itself, in the south of England itself, there are neighboring territories like Wales and Cornwall, where non-Germanic Celtic languages are still very common. But as the English government gets stronger, and as the printing press technology comes out, and as education becomes more common, more and more people learn English. And it gets to the place now where the older languages are not common at all. Quite often, older people are the ones who speak them well. And a lot of languages simply become extinct. And this process happens all over the world at this time. I mean, all over Eurasia, where certain languages become more common because of printing. And everybody learns the languages. In Russia, everybody, in what becomes the Russian Empire, everybody learns Russian because of printing. German becomes much more common. The book gives the example of how what we nowadays call French used to only be spoken around Paris. But because the government centralized and printed stuff in the dialect of Paris and eventually passed laws telling people you had to educate your kids in these languages, this meant that all of the other local languages and dialects eventually died out. Nowadays, there are only a few small local languages in France that still have any common that are still commonly used at all. And so overall, the trend you see during this time is towards stronger government, more effective military weapons. The book mentions how once gunpowder technology becomes common, the rate of killings as a result of military conflict skyrockets. Far more people die in conflict after guns are invented than before. But also, you see the centralization of government. You see the standardization of language. You see a rapid decline in local distinctions in language. The other thing to mention before, too, is that people in government really begin to see religion as a means to unify a state and as a means to separate from political units and declare independence. But what you don't see during this time is significant conflict between different major faith groups. There is a recognition of at the leadership class that there's no point in fighting the Ottomans trying to make them become Christians. They're not going to become Christians. The Ottomans themselves, when they go into European territories, they are not trying to convert people. They're perfectly willing to let Christians stay Christians, let Jews stay Jews. Now in the Ottoman system, or in the Safavid system, in the Mughal system, although the Mughals less so because they are a minority, these folks have Muslims on top, but they make life pretty comfortable for people who aren't Muslims because they want those people treated well, they want them paying money, they want them to feel they have a stake in the government, even if they're not the people on top. And so we don't see the same kind of dogged insistence on trying to convert people outside of a faith community that had existed in earlier times in history. And I think that's something that the authors don't mention that's really important, and I want you all to take note of that. That might be something that pops up as a question. Uh, Anyway, class, I just wanted to give you that information. I'm going to post one more lecture on chapter 18 in the next day or two. And anyway, I hope this is useful. Take care.